So I would like to now introduce our first speaker, who's going to be Michael Dimock, who is the president of the Pew Research Center, and he's going to be talking with us about public understanding of science, energy, and the environment. Welcome.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, Sally, for the introduction, and thank you, Jay, for pulling us together, and Carl for emceeing us so capably. I wanted to talk with you today about some of the work that we've been doing at the Pew Research Center related to these issues. The Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan organization trying to bring facts to the table to try to help enrich the public conversation and inform sound decision making. We don't take positions on issues, but we try to bring information to the table, particularly about the public. And so I'm really excited that we decided here to start with a little bit of a public perspective, not because I believe the public should be the decision maker on a lot of these issues, but understanding how public see things is the context in which a lot of what we're talking about here happens. I'm going to give you three sort of mini presentations here very quickly because I want to get on to the panel and the discussion that I think will be more interesting. And they're on three different topics: global views of climate change, U.S. views on environmental regulation, and an analysis we've been doing on knowledge and attitudes about energy issues. And there's some underlying themes behind these about how people form judgments about different types of issues in this space. Let's start with climate change. Last spring, we undertook a 40-nation study of public opinion about a host of issues, but did a pretty serious module on views about climate change and climate-related policy in advance of the Paris talks last fall. And we found a remarkably diverse set of concerns and reactions, I think, to the climate issue. This map is showing you the percent per country that we interviewed saying global climate change is a very serious problem for the world. And you can see, I think pretty quickly, the diversity of opinions with real highs in places like Brazil, Burkina Faso, India, real lows, particularly in China, where this is not seen as a pressing problem, although I think the context there is there are other environmental issues that really trump this at the front lines of public awareness in China right now. And what we found is one of the strongest correlates of concern about this is how much people think it's really going to affect them. And you see, again, this same pattern about where people see the impact. This is the share of people in each country saying that climate change is going to harm them personally. Again, very high numbers in a lot of the developing world. And in general, the pattern that we saw was much more concern in developing nations about the potential impact of climate change on their societies than we were seeing in the developed world. If you array those countries a different way, here I'm doing a scatter plot where across the bottom you're seeing the per capita CO2 emissions that each country delivers, and then up the side is how general level of concern about climate change expressed by publics in those. You see sort of a negative correlation, as we would call it. The countries that are producing more don't tend to express quite as much concern about the issue as publics in countries that are not producing as much CO2. But another part of this study that I think is relevant is that the concern is different in different areas, although the most present concern we heard from people about the potential impacts of climate change was about drought and water shortages. A median of 44% across the countries that we talked to described that as the most pressing issue associated with climate change. That concern also had a very geographic element to it. This is breaking down the share who pointed to drought or water limitations as the primary concern about climate change. And you can see it was particularly acute concern in Latin America and Africa. Among all the choices that we offered them about what potential impacts climate change could have, that was by far the majority concern in those parts of the world. Less of a concern as you go to other areas. At the bottom, I show in particular the Mexican, US, and Canadian answers to this question, and you see that same pattern. Drought, a much higher concern in general in Mexico than in US and Canada when they think about the impacts of climate change. But the regional differentiation exists within these countries as well. So not surprisingly, perhaps, for those living in the West, drought is a big concern, right? And when we asked people in the US about what aspects of climate change worried them, drought came to the top of the list by far. When we talked to people in the western part of this country, much more so than in the Northeast or the South. And you can see similar patterns within Mexico, with a little more concern about drought as the main factor or impact of climate change in the north, also in Mexico City area particularly. And in Canada, a bit more of a concern about it in the western side of the country, British Columbia and the Plains, than in the eastern areas of the country. I want to get, though, to the main issue about climate change, which is it's a very politicized issue. It won't surprise you, the numbers at the top here, the share of Republicans, Democrats, and independents in the United States that describe climate change as a very serious problem. Climate change has grown to be one of the single most polarized issues in American political conversation at the public level, not just at the elite level. That's not always been the case. Back in the early 2000s, there was zero partisan difference on the issue of climate change. This has grown into a very highly partisan issue. And we found a similar, though not quite as extreme, partisan divide over climate change in a lot of advanced democracies. We were asking this question in places like Germany, Britain, Australia, Canada, as you can see here. And we were seeing the same sort of partisanship or partisan orientation or division when it came to the issue of climate change. What we didn't see was that same sort of partisanship when it came to developing nations. And you can see even in Mexico, this was a survey conducted last spring again, so a little time has passed, but very little difference of opinion at the public level, at least, about this issue. Let me flip on to the other theme, which is how Americans view issues of environmental regulations. There's a question we've been asking for more than 20 years now, which just asks people a trade-off question. And no trade-off is perfect, but this captures, we have a number of other questions, one way people think about environment versus economic impacts. So the blue line is showing the share who say they think stricter environmental laws and regulations cost too many jobs and hurt the economy. The yellow line, the share of Americans who say stricter environmental laws and regulations are worth the costs. And there hasn't been a great deal of movement in American opinion on this, as you can see. It's spiked and valleyed a little bit. There's been a little bit of movement around economic ups and downs. As economic situations tighten, public concerns can grow. But for the most part, this has been a fairly stable opinion. Last year, we did a study where we did 35,000 interviews all around the United States on a host of issues, one of which was on this, and that allowed us to get a little bit more regional granularity on public attitudes about this. And you can see a pattern here of where the darker colors, where higher shares of the populations were expressing support for the environmental protection side of that trade-off, and the lighter colors where people were more concerned about the job and economic impacts of regulation. A map that perhaps won't surprise folks when they think about the politics of some of these areas, but it raised questions to us about what are the real correlates of this at the public level. One of them is clearly politics. So again, here now I'm arraying all 50 states. Higher means you're more supportive of environmental regulation on this. And over on the left, you have more Republican states. On the right, you have more Democratic states. I guess I could have flipped that. You can see a very tight political correlation here as well. The main point of this, the more Democratic a state is, this is based on the margin of victory in 2012 election, you see a very clear connection between views on environmental regulation and the politics of the state writ large. You also, though, see a correlation, though more fuzzy, a little more noise in it, between the wealth of a state. This is a per capita income, but you can use any other measures of income or economic strength in a state. And you see, again, a slightly positive correlation, wealthier states being more, in general, supportive of the environmental regulation side than states that are not as high on the income scale. And then we also tried to do a correlation between how much extractive energy is a part of that state's economy. So you can see way out on the right side of this, Wyoming, Alaska, West Virginia, North Dakota, Oklahoma, some of the states that are very high in oil, gas, and mining, a bit lower in terms of this environmental regulation side. So I think the takeaway from this is all of these factors matter, but probably the single tightest correlate of these attitudes, at least right now, is politics. And let me just wrap up with a third issue about knowledge. I think that an educated citizenry matters, and I agree with the point that Sally made before about public understanding of issues is typically helpful. What we struggled with is trying to understand whether a more scientifically literate society is going to have different views on some of these policy issues. And this is a very complicated chart, but I just want to give you a sense of what we tried to do here, which is study public attitudes about a whole host of scientific issues. I'm only showing you the ones here that relate to energy environmental concerns. And we tried to understand how much different characteristics at the individual level mattered in terms of their attitudes about these issues. And the key columns that you can focus on here is sort of the third one over. It's called education or science knowledge. This is really a scale of scientific literacy, how much people really understand basic principles about science, how it works. Some of them are factual. You know, what is the gas that's believed to cause climate change? You know, do people know that CO2 is an issue here? Not everybody does. And what you see there is a lot of light colors, and that's signifying here very little relationship to the public attitudes, weak relationships between how knowledgeable people are and what they think about these issues. Where you see the darkest colors in those columns under party and the column under age, those are the bigger divides right now in terms of how Americans look at these issues. Almost all of the energy issues we tested very quickly fell into this partisan divide that we've been seeing in some of the other charts already. Almost uniformly, the single most powerful factor in driving people's attitudes about these issues. That's not the case about all scientific issues. It's particularly around this energy environment area. But also fairly strong age correlates on all of these as well. I can give you one example of this on fracking. We did one of the questions was about support for fracking, and what you see is, in general, slightly more opposition than support in the US right now for increased fracking, but it's not an overwhelming public viewpoint. You see very little difference between people who are more sort of scientifically literate and less so, and you can see, not surprisingly, a huge partisan and ideological divide over the use of fracking. The other finding that I don't show here is that when you really look at that party effect by scientific knowledge, the more knowledgeable people are, the more those partisan divides grow, right? So if you look among the folks who really are more educated, more scientifically oriented, the gap between Democrats and Republicans only gets wider. And so to some extent, there's an interaction between knowledge and partisanship that takes place in the US and I think in other countries to the extent that we've studied it. So I think just to wrap up, I'd say there are some underlying factors here. Clearly, personal impact and experiences matter in how people think about these things, and that means that often reactions to these issues can be very localized. Economic well-being matters in terms of how people assess environmental issues. That energy in the US and many advanced countries has become a deeply politicized area at the public level. And that in general, sort of scientific literacy doesn't change people's views, but it can often interact with other factors that are shaping their views on these issues. Well, let me wrap up on the data side of it here and bring out our panelists. We have joining me Colin Robertson, who is a writer for the Globe and Mail in Canada. Duncan Wood, who's the director of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And moderating our session today is Jeff Ball, who is a fellow at the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance at Stanford University. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I hope you're caffeinated, and if you're not caffeinated, you're going to be zizzed up at the end of this discussion, I hope. So we have about 23 minutes, and we're going to cover a lot of territory here. There's been a really good introduction so far, and we're going to try to sort of dig into a few of those issues and sort of seed the discussion for the next 2 days. So let me just start by just setting the stage about where we are. Sally referred to this extraordinary energy revolution. So let's just throw out a couple of data points to make sure we're all starting in the same place. Oil, as Sally said, is at $33. Natural gas is at about $2.30. Coal prices, there's essentially a coal glut in the world. If you are, and renewable energy prices, the cost of renewable energy and therefore the price of contracts are falling extraordinarily. If you are a consumer in this room, you're liking that picture. If you're one of the CEOs in this room, you're not liking that picture so much. In fact, I looked at the stock prices of most of the companies represented here this weekend, and they've taken a quite sizable dip lately. So we'll get into that. Let's talk for a quick second about CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions, according to the latest 2014 numbers, were flat in the world and slightly down in the United States. We're just off of the Paris Climate Conference. A lot of countries ponied up agreements, and yet the scientists tell us that those agreements don't add up to anything near what the world would need to avoid surpassing a threshold of 2 degrees over pre-industrial levels, which is what scientists say the world ought to do. So that's where we are. Let's go back and let's start at Mike's slides. And let me just try to sort of simplify, and then we can poke holes in my simplification. So we are about to have 2 days of kind of erudite, fact-filled discussion about energy and the environment. But basically what Mike's numbers have told us is that that doesn't matter. Mike has told us that climate change concerns in rich countries depend on political ideology, that the big emitters, China and the United States, essentially care a lot less than other countries care, and that with regard to climate change, those who do care are the countries that don't add up to much of the problem. What do you make of that?
If I can speak from the point of view of Mexico, what's interesting is that although Mexico is a relatively low emitter per capita, it's the 10th largest emitter in the world. And Mexico, of course, is a country that has based a large part of its economic history, certainly in the 20th century, on oil. It's not seen internationally as being a particularly clean country, and yet there has been a very, very high level of acceptance of the reality of climate change and of the need for the government to do something about that. And we've had one of the most proactive governments, certainly amongst the less developed countries. And beginning in 2006 with Felipe Calderón, and that has been pursued by President Enrique Peña Nieto over the past 3 years. Mexico last year was the first developing country to submit its INDC for Paris, and lays out a relatively ambitious plan for reducing carbon emissions. So I think that what we've seen, Mexico is a very interesting case. It's a little bit of an outlier, I would say, certainly amongst the developing countries, because it's one of the first developing countries to accept that it too has a responsibility here. And a lot of that can be traced back to the influence of one man, and that was President Felipe Calderón, who actually placed the responsibility on his father. His father was one of the sort of first Mexican politicians to embrace the idea of sustainable development. Calderón took that on, and as he was thinking about the modernization of the Mexican energy sector, he also thought about how Mexico could play a leadership role in the world on the issue of climate change. And that has begun to play its way through into this administration, even though it's of a different political party. So it's a very interesting
So let me just focus this for a second. How, all of you guys, how would Mike's numbers have looked different, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago? In other words, is what you've articulated much of a change, or is it essentially a status quo? Mike, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, at the U.S. level, we haven't seen an enormous amount of movement on a lot of these issues.
Despite all the price change, despite Paris.
Right, I mean, and I think it's true that, that American attitudes about environment, economic issues used to fluctuate even more with gas prices and economic pressures than
Gasoline
I think they
prices.
do today. I mean, it used to be this sort of notion that gas prices drove everything for the public's mindset. We've seen gas prices at these remarkable lows for a while, and it hasn't resulted in fundamental shifts in public views, no.
Colin?
Jeff, I'd say, well, first, to my American friends, elections have consequences, and we've had 2 significant elections in Canada in the last year. And if I'd been sitting here last year, I would have predicted probably different outcomes than what we got in Canada. We had a seismic shift in Alberta, which is, in a sense, our Texas, where they moved to by American standards, almost a socialist government, and running in part on climate change policies. And they've in fact, yesterday they came out with a new royalty review, which isn't substantially different, in part underlying what Mike says about policy can shift, but after you've taken a good hard look at it, but it represented a significant shift in Alberta. And then in Canada, and this, again, for those who are looking at your primaries with some askance, I'd say the candidate that went in last place, and remember, we run our elections on 45 days, not on sort of 2-year cycles. The candidate in third place.
Note to the United States.
Right, became Justin Trudeau wound up in first place, with a majority government, running in on a platform of strong environmental and climate change. In fact, going to Paris, of countries present, we were the very different approach than the previous government, the Harper government, would have taken. And now, from a kind of bottoms-up perspective, in fact, one of the reasons our environment minister is here today, environment and climate change, I should underline, they've changed the name of the portfolio to reflect the importance to the current national government, meeting with her provincial counterparts, because in Canada, the natural resources owned by the provinces, they have to play the key role, and they in fact are playing the key role in climate change. We've got 3 of the provinces, two of the biggest, Ontario and Quebec, and now Manitoba, lined up with California on sort of the western climate. In Alberta, as I mentioned, they've just been through a significant look at their royalty structure, and they will be putting a higher levy on carbon. And in British Columbia, which is the only jurisdiction in North America that's had a carbon tax for over a decade now, they're looking at that. So we'll see a kind of bottoms-up approach in Canada, and that will move us, I think, forward towards meeting the Paris climate.
So we have absolutely seen, we the world, have absolutely seen more aggressive articulation of climate goals, really across the board, in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, in China. The question I want to ask is the messier one, which is, let's move from political rhetoric to actual action, and actual action at a level that, at least according to scientists, would be relevant. Do you guys, I'm not asking what you hope, wherever you stand on this, I'm asking what you think, and will that degree of action happen, and over what time frame might it happen if you think it will?
Well, I think it will. I think that Paris really was significant shift. There is an attitudinal shift, which I think Michael's data points out, taking place, and I think governments are now, it's now part of the system, and moreover, with technology, we can start figuring out who's being honest and who's not. And I think the Chinese, in fact, came forward because they recognize, and they've got a huge domestic problem because of pollution, not just air, land, but also water. So I think there is a fundamental shift going on to see what has happened. I think we will, not as fast as environmentalists would like it, but governments are now seized of this, and it doesn't matter what government. The fact that you did get this unanimity in Paris, which if you'd looked at the Copenhagen experience, you simply wouldn't have predicted that.
Duncan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, in the case of Mexico, I think that there's a great deal of hope here. There is an ambitious commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% towards by 2050, over 2000 levels. They've got an interim standard of a 36% reduction if certain international conditions are met by 2030. There's a heavy focus right now on reducing black carbon emissions, which is something which will have a sort of a short-term impact. It's part of a broader package of policies, including legislation that focuses on making electricity generation greener. A lot of that has to do with bringing in natural gas from the United States. We've already seen emissions from electricity generation declining rapidly because of the conversion from fuel oil generation to natural gas in Mexico. We've got a comprehensive energy transition legislative package which was passed in December. And most of all, I think we see that the success of the energy reform legislation from 2013 and 2014 is actually beginning to have a very positive role, because it's leading to the modernization of the sector. It's money that will come in for infrastructure, for generation, even into Pemex itself for refining, that are going to lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's the good news. What a lot of people see out there, and one of the reasons why they have doubts, is because Mexico has some of the best laws in the world, and most of them are not implemented. And that's always been a challenge in Mexico. Every Mexican can point to the Constitution and to all the laws that are on the books and say, we have the best laws in the world, and yet still things go wrong in this country. I think we may be seeing something different, though. I think there's still reason for optimism, because what we see in Mexico is that we've now almost see a state policy, as opposed to a governmental policy. It's now a política de Estado of the Mexican state in general on climate change. It's crossed over from one administration to another. This administration tries to outdo the previous one. And you see an overwhelming acceptance of the importance of this from political elites in the country.
Okay, so Mike, from the standpoint of supporters of climate action, what we've just heard is a very optimistic view. If one believes that the world should do more about climate change, these guys are saying the stars are aligning. I'm not sure I see that in your numbers.
Well, there's one thing that was missing from that in a map of the world that I wish I had included in this deck, which was a different question that we asked around the world, which was, irrespective of how much of a problem you think climate change is or how much of an effect it might have on you, would you support your country limiting greenhouse gas emissions as part of an international agreement in Paris this fall? Again, this was done last spring.
Before Paris.
Right, before Paris. And you found much more global unanimity on the desire to see their countries participate in agreements to address CO2 emissions. In some countries, enormous gaps, particularly in places like China, where, as we saw, there wasn't a lot of concern about climate change, but there was a lot of public desire to see something happen. Now, the extent to which public desire matters in a place like China is a question, but again, the sense is that there was a desire, even in the US, 69% of Americans told us they wanted to see the US collaborate and work with the rest of the world to try to address this issue. So there is a public desire to see things happen, even if the public feels some ambivalence about the data and the way it'll affect them.
But of course, a public desire to see things happen is different from politicians' desire to actually do specific things.
Right.
But Jeff, do not forget what's happened in the last decade. Think of this continent. We are now, as a continent, energy independent thanks to disruptive technology, thanks to extraordinary efforts by the private sector to figure out, okay, how can we get more oil and gas out of what previously was simply not able to do. At the same time we're looking at being able to harness resources, you're seeing the private sector at the same time conscious that they now have environmental responsibilities, and I certainly see that up in the oil sands. Reduction of water, for example. The dark pits painted by Avatar and National Geographic a decade ago, they don't exist anymore because they've figured out they don't use as much water, and they've now planted trees and things. The stuff is coming back because the incentive to do so, not just in a financial sense, but a moral sense. I do think that industry, I think that's a significant change, is that the industry is feeling beaten up, and they are now putting big efforts. And I look at that, certainly the Canadian oil sands industry, they are putting a lot of effort now into how do we have better systems so we use less water and much more environment friendly, because they want to present a better face to the public who are their shareholders are demanding.
Okay, so let's take that point. So we are going to come back to this question of energy independence in a moment. But right now, you are no longer sitting up here talking to a group of people in Beaver Creek. You are, all of you, advisors, you're consultants to certain constituencies. So Colin, you are now a consultant to the Canadian natural resources industry. And in fact, some of the CEOs in this audience have hired you to tell them not what you want to happen, but what you think will happen, how it will affect them, and what they ought to do about it. So what's your elevator pitch to justify what they're paying you?
Yeah, my elevator pitch is you've got to continue to tell your story about what you're doing in an environmentally safe fashion,
So
because the public
you're
doesn't
doing
get
enough.
that.
You just have to communicate it better.
Yes, tell your story, because I do think they are doing it. The technological breakthroughs, they're keeping it to the industry, but they need to tell the public and then share that. And I would and then I turn to the environmentalists and say, you've got to put truly some water in your wine. You cannot be as hard-minded. You can't be vandals on pipelines and things. You've got to, and this is where government has to play a role. Government has to come in and say, we want to bring these two sides together and try and make, because there's got to be social license. That's what we're facing right now in Canada, is that our Prime Minister has said, if we want to build these pipelines to either coast to get our energy to Tidewater, which provides a bunch of other good things, then there's got to be social license. And that includes working with the environmental movement and working with our First Nations, and industry has got to step up. And we did this with the Boreal Forest Accord, so there's no reason why we can't do it with oil and gas.
So we'll come back to government in a second. So Duncan, what do you tell the Mexican oil industry?
I would say look to February the 11th of this year. North America's energy and natural resources ministers get together in Winnipeg, the poor people, and they
One
will.
of the coldest capitals.
Yes, absolutely. They're going to.
Fargo North.
But that is representative of a process that's been underway for the last couple of years of bringing together North America's energy ministers to talk about issues of climate change and energy. There is now a North American Climate Change and Energy Working Group. There used to be a North American Energy Working Group. Now it's the Climate Change and Energy Working Group, We have a US president who's in his last year. He's looking for a legacy issue, something that he can get through. You've got a new prime minister in Canada who's relatively enthusiastic, at least.
Green.
Yes, right, let's call him green. And in Mexico, you've got a president who's already shown that he's willing to take legislative steps as well as international cooperation steps. What are the chances, and this is what I would say to anybody in the hydrocarbons industry, what are the chances that this year we might see a concerted effort towards carbon pricing and a focus on methane leakage as an issue?
As a national policy in Mexico or more broadly than
I'm
that?
talking about a North American coordinated approach.
Okay, so
on
that's
this.
the political stage. So what do you then tell your clients in the industry they therefore ought to do about that?
Prepare yourselves for a carbon price at some point in the near future that will be coordinated, not harmonized entirely, but coordinated across North America. Prepare yourselves for much more aggressive government action. And that preparation can be lobbying to try to prevent it, or it can be start to build that into your pricing.
And do you recommend A or B as their prudent strategy?
You got to do both. You can't choose one or the other because it's been shown time and time again that no matter how hard you lobby against something, and I would say that Keystone is the best example of this, when you have logic on your side, you have the weight of industry behind you, you still can't win it.
And one last quick question. What's the carbon price you tell them that they ought to prepare for and when?
Well, I think Alberta has given us a very good clue on that one. I mean, Alberta has $30 per ton, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and British Columbia has also put actually a tax on. And I think we're going to get it. It's going to be a smorgasbord of options aiming to a common goal. That will be important. So one size does not fit all, and at the same time encouraging industry to be competitive to come up with, because I think industry will figure it out.
Yeah, and Mexico went a different way.
What's the year,
remember.
Duncan? What's the year that Mexican industry has to worry about a carbon price?
I think we're looking at somewhere sort of within the 5 to 10 year range.
Okay, Michael, now you're on the spot. And I know as a pollster, you're not hired by anyone to recommend anything. But let me ask it this way. You are giving a presentation to a conference of energy executives. And you are not just presenting data, but what you're trying to do is present as specifically as possible what data is maximally relevant to their bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
What would you focus on and suggest that they watch most specifically?
Right. I think on the climate issue in particular, it's that gap. Don't just take the public uncertainty or the push-pull they've had over the science behind climate change as a sign that there really isn't a will to see something done. And I think the survey question I mentioned before is one example of that. The public's frustration with inaction at the governmental level is very palpable. You're seeing it play out in other places right now. And I think there is a public desire to see action that could really override other things if the right forces come together. The other thing that I would add is, the energy industry is not in a terrible position vis-a-vis the public's perceptions. We actually did a separate project last year that asked people to rate different sectors of the economy, of business places, as well as other major institutions. And we had more people saying they had a positive than a negative impression of the energy industry. That was well above the image of banks, of the entertainment industry, of the news media, and way above the public impressions of government. And that, perhaps surprisingly to some, that positive impression is even stronger among younger generations than older generations. And the strongest parallel to that is how people view the technology industry, which is overwhelmingly viewed favorably and extremely favorably among younger generations. And I think that there's an opportunity to really focus on technological change and innovation, which I think people talk about a lot. I mean, it's what we're here to talk about. But it is a big part of how people can better understand that changes are happening that are helping to address these problems.
All right, so I'm going to keep you guys on task for a second. So we're going to come back to this question of just what you talked about messaging in the context of energy independence in a moment. But let me ask one other thing. And that is, you're now not advising oil executives, you're now advising politicians. And we will come back in a moment to Hillary and Donald. But now, Colin, you are advising politicians in your country. And again, you're not telling them what you think they ought to do to change the world. You're telling them what you think they ought to do to get reelected. What do you tell them based on Mike's data and sort of your view of the world?
Well, I think one thing you've underlined is energy companies have increasingly become technology companies, with energy as being their kind of production, but they're essentially into technology. But to do that, you've got to provide the kind of base to encourage that. And I think I would be saying to governments, make sure you give them lots of space for innovation and for competition. That's the
And in the Canadian context, be more specific. What does that mean you should do and you should not do?
It means that I don't think you necessarily have to provide big incentives for drilling, but what you want to do is provide make the tax system to encourage innovation by the energy companies, whether they're oil and gas or hydro or solar or alternative energy. That's where I think give them some space so that the innovation takes place, and the innovation will encourage competition.
So this is R&D spending?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so Duncan, Mexico's just through an energy reform. You're talking about an increasingly concerted effort on the climate front in Mexico. You are sitting in the office in Mexico City and you're advising the government. What do you say? Again, the goal is political survival here.
Yeah, I think that first thing to do is to focus on some of the easier things that you can do out there, which is harmonization of regulations, modernization of regulations. And we're seeing this as a discussion on a North American basis right now. I think there's a lot that can be done between the three countries. Then I think that you talk about the modernization of infrastructure. That's a very clear thing. It creates jobs. And then you talk about, the same thing that Colin just mentioned. The innovation agenda is a winner. It really is. And Mexico has a lamentable record on innovation for a lot of reasons. The education system isn't particularly successful, and they haven't built in many incentives, financial or otherwise, for innovation in the country. But there's a lot of innovative and creative people there. Getting minds focused on energy, getting minds focused on cleaner energy is a winning strategy, I would say.
Okay, now, last bit of advice. First of all, you guys are all advising the Hillary Clinton campaign. Again, your goal is to put Hillary Clinton in the White House. What do you tell the campaign? Who wants to start? Real quick.
How about you, Jeff?
I'm asking the questions.
With regards to climate change.
And energy.
And energy. All right. I think that one of the things that we've seen, apart from all the complaints that people have about Mrs. Clinton to do with her attitude and supposed arrogance, I think that there's an issue out there that she has to overcome what this administration has suffered from, which has been seen as being opposed to the energy sector in many ways. But I think she's already doing that. I think that she's come out. Whether she flip-flops or whether she just changes her mind or whether this is what she meant to say all along on Keystone, she has to recognize that the energy sector has created enormous wealth and economic opportunity in this country.
So Duncan, now no one wanted to talk, and now these guys both want to jump in. So Colin, go ahead.
My advice may be glib, but I'd talk to Bill Clinton. I think the Clinton Foundation.
You do, or you would?
I would. I would say talk to her husband, because I think as president he moved things, and I think that some of the stuff the Clinton Foundation has done in recent years, particularly in developing countries on energy innovation, working with Gates and others, has been quite pathbreaking. I think that would be, and she's probably doing it anyways.
And Mike, what do the numbers say Hillary Clinton ought to do?
The numbers? I think that you have to understand that people feel everything is an us versus them, winner-loser scenario right now. And I think if you want to try to lead in these areas, you need to try to get people to see this as not zero-sum. Try to focus on areas that are win-win propositions where gains can be made that are just for collective goods. That's a hard message to deliver in a moment where everybody, where there's a general centrifugal force that pulls a lot of these debates into we're winning, they're losing. If they're winning, we're losing. But the more you could try to focus on the areas that are not net loss, that the areas where there are net.
And what do the numbers
gains.
say one of the two of those areas are for the Democrats?
I think a lot of that's technical. The methane emission, leakage. There are a lot of ways where you could say, look, we're not going to tackle the massive, meet our Paris targets in one fell swoop. So let's start with logical things that everybody can agree on, that we know there are solutions to. I think just approaching it in a practical way.
All right, and now same question for, let's say Trump is the Republican nominee. Yeah. What do the numbers say a Republican nominee ought to do?
I think it's probably similar, because the issue is each side has sort of been demonized by the other side, distrusted by the other side. So anybody who leans environmental just has an inherent distrust of the motivations of any Republican, Donald Trump, anybody. And so I think tackling that, trying to find those opportunities to articulate not zero-sum wins, ways that everybody can get ahead.
So Duncan, you live in Washington. You want to advise Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? What do you tell them?
Don't make me advise the Donald, please. I mean, I tell you, I work at the Wilson Center. Right next door is the old post office, was being transformed into the Trump Hotel. I run the Mexico Institute. There's no way that I can have my guests stay there. After the things that he said about Mexico and Mexicans, I mean, if I have to make that choice of who I'm going to advise, it's clearly going to be a Democrat, I'm afraid.
All right, so let's say you're advising a Republican other than Donald Trump.
Okay. So a reasonable Republican. There you go, a double R. Okay, good. Yeah, I think that the time has come, and I think the numbers show it, that Republican voters are coming around on the question of climate change. There's still a big gap from the Democrats, but the numbers are shifting. And so it's time to actually modernize the approach on this. And I think that, I spend a lot of my time talking to industry. Industry is preparing itself for it. So, if the concern was always we'll lose the support of the energy sector if we become more aggressive on climate action, I just don't think that the numbers are going to bear that out in the medium term. I mean, conversations that we've had at the World Economic Forum, I'm part of the Oil and Gas Global Advisory Council, and it is everybody there from the industry recognizes that something is going to change in the not too distant future, and they're preparing themselves for it.
Okay, so sorry to cut you off, but we have just a few minutes left, and I want to do one more thing and then see if we can get to a question or two from the audience. Colin, you mentioned the notion of independence, and Mike, you talked about sort of promises that are being made by candidates. I want to talk about words. Seems to me there is a war of words going on both at the politicians' level and in the public level. And let me just throw out a couple of words. So energy independence, clean coal, tar sands or oil sands, climate change or global warming, and I suspect that the list could go green, clean energy. So we don't have time to get into the intricacies of all these words. What I want to ask you is, does it matter? Because my impression is that the companies represented here, wherever they fall on the energy spectrum, and frankly the NGOs represented here, wherever those NGOs or companies fall on the political spectrum, are spending a lot of money on consultants who are advising them on what words to use. So someone cares. Does it matter, and if it matters, in what way does it matter?
Well, politicians use it for framing the debate, as Michael points out. When green is better than the language. I think the environmental movement has done a very good job in the past decades of using language to affect, to in a sense shift public opinion. And I think industry's now come along to realize language matters to them as well. And and I get back to where I said industry has to do a better job of telling their story in a fashion that is not technical and using language. I take a lot of language of the environmental movement. And I'd say the environmental movement, if they really want to make progress, have to talk with industry. Maybe this kind of dialogue we're having today, and I do think it will work. I look at we used to have a big difference in Canada, but on the forest industry, and the forest industry was vilified in the environment. But they came together, and we came up with an accord, and now you don't hear anything about it because it's working.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, language matters, to be sure, and you can do any number of A/B tests about how to phrase things, and it'll make a difference. But I think the public is also aware of messaging and skeptical of messaging, and I think most data would suggest that it's actually the source, it's who's talking that matters more than the actual words. And I'm not saying words don't matter, but it's about the credibility of the source speaking on the issue, and that's I think a much bigger
If I can
issue.
just jump
Please,
in.
please.
Getting rid of global warming was one of the best things we could have done because it prevents
The phenomenon or
the phrase. Getting rid of that in the common
Why?
lexicon, because by using global warming, you actually allow that one U.S. congressman or woman to walk in to the chamber on a snowy day in Washington and say, look, do you believe in global warming when this is happening outside? And as ridiculous as that is, it just prolongs the agony a little bit more. You start talking about climate change and extreme weather, and everybody sees that on a regular basis. And in northern Mexico, for example, it was interesting. The figures on drought make perfect sense because they've had the drought up there the same as southern Texas did. But they've also had extreme weather. Go to southern Mexico, you've had very, very real problems with extreme weather, hurricanes, flooding, etc. Many lives lost due to that. That's the kind of language that I think people can coalesce around.
All right, so we're already in overtime, but I want to give you 5 seconds, Mike. So there's a commonality of questions here, and I just want to really quick get it to. And basically, a number of these questions ask, in an era that is so politically polarized on the question of energy and the question of climate, does scientific knowledge matter? And I want to ask it because it seems to me quite relevant for the discussion that's going to happen today and tomorrow. Does it matter? What do the numbers say?
I think it's really important for the public to gain a better understanding on a lot of these issues, but you shouldn't be looking to the public to find the solution. They're looking to experts to figure out where the right middle points are, where the win-wins are, and you can educate the public up as much as possible, but they're not the ones that are going to lead on this. They're going to follow.
I think the public likes science. We just had an election in which science was a place of it, and the Liberal Party, which won, seized on and in fact criticized the Conservatives as being anti-science, and they had some good reason. And the public, I think, very much one of the reasons they voted for the Liberals is because they saw, yes, science does matter. In fact, now the new Conservative Party is trying to push the Liberals to use more science, more evidence. So I think that is a reflection. And I just remind you to go back to your Trump. Conservative.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
Conservative and conserve. Last night we had an intelligent conservative on here, Rob Portman. If you had more like him, I think he gets that. He does. It's clear. His energy efficiency bill. We don't hear enough of that. At least don't hear much in Canada. You hear about the gridlock, but what he talked about was something quite positive that he's trying to work through Congress, and that left me encouraged. I came away last night and said, you know what? Here's a guy who's trying to work from the Conservative side with the Liberal side to make something happen that's going to be positive.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Please
you.
join me in thanking Colin, Duncan, and Mike.